L'chaim, Greg A. Robinson Nakanim, Hayumasi Puschagu Uksan, Dret Flush Pusenslaga Mythlite, Kabayakwa Uksan. I'm saying my name's Greg A. Robinson, and I'm thanking you for being here today, and that it's good for you all to be here. So a little bit about myself. I'm an enrolled member of the Chinook Indian Nation, and our part of the Chinookan group is located at the mouth of the Columbia River in Willapa Bay. And Chinookan group actually runs all the way from that area, both sides of the mouth, all the way up to about the Dalles. And some of those Chinookan bands are included in the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, which is why you see a lot of interaction between myself and Grand Ronde. Greg Archuleta there is of one of those Chinookan bands. And so I think oftentimes people think of Chinook and they think of just one group, but it's actually, if you would think about it in the old days, and you ran into another Chinook and you'd ask them who they were, they'd say, oh, I'm from this town, or I'm from this place. So they were identified from being from a place. So today you might say, oh, I'm a Portlander. And next person say, oh, I'm a Vancouver person. And so that's how those bands or tribes were known, those villages. It wasn't just one tribe all the way up. And actually, there's some cultural changes that occur all the way up as you go upriver. So I'm going to give you a little bit of cultural background before I start specifically talking about what I've done here. There's a couple of things to know about Chinookan culture to help you understand the art form. And probably the most significant is status. So Chinookan society is very much driven by status and wealth. And everything is given a status. Even the river itself generally is considered high status at the mouth of the river, and as you go up the river, it becomes the lower status into the river. A plank house specifically has a high status into the house, which is where the headman or the owner of the house would live at the far end. The entrance, the door of the entrance would be considered the low status of the poor end of the house. And so a house would have an extended family, and there might be as many as 40 people living in there, but the person with the highest status and his family are living behind a curtain way up at the other end of the house. There's no door over there. The only door into the house is usually a portal, a little oval-shaped thing, and you have to stoop down and get in there. And it's partly because anybody that enters is at a bit of a disadvantage. You can't just rush in there with a group of people to rob or to kill people. You have to bend down, stoop in, and when you do so, you're vulnerable to whoever's inside. But also, the people living at that end of the house are the most vulnerable. So that's kind of all a reflection of that status. So most everything in the art, beyond, I would say, even to the point of the simple craft type items, arrowheads and mortars and pestles, so art has that same status. There are art pieces that would be considered to be very high status, and there's art pieces that are on the lower end of the scale that are just used in daily, everyday use. So with that, I think I'm going to start with the main panel, and we're going to do a couple of things on the panel. I actually have some pieces to install, some new pieces to install on the panel, which has always been part of the original theme of movement, and that's kind of what my portion of this is about cultural movement and how culture isn't a stagnated thing. It's oftentimes you go to a museum and it's like a photo album. You just see these things, oh, that's from this part of history and that's from this part of history, but it just kind of starts and ends right there. Where that's actually not an accurate representation of, I don't think, of any culture. And so my point in this exhibit and in what we do with teaching and interacting with the public is to show that this culture has continued in this continuous thread, this flow or this current from the beginning of our existence and continues through this day despite some pretty major interruptions along the way. So everything in this part of my exhibit is a reflection of that movement in one way or the other, either in the abstract sense or in the physical sense. On this panel, so this is a piece of red cedar. Red cedar being the main carving wood for virtually every Northwest Coast tribe that had access to it. And it's because it's a soft wood that's easily carved, so before steel is available, you're able to carve on it with stone tools and shell and things of that nature. But it's also quite durable. It has a toxic oil in it called thujone, and so it lasts for quite a long while. So all the houses were built out of it. Canoes are made out of it. But everything also has a life, so even though it lasts for a long time, like today, we'll constantly maintain a house, so it lasts for as long as it possibly can last. When something rots away, they replace it. But in our old houses, it had a life, a period of a timeline that from its birth to its death, and it was allowed to go through that cycle just like we are as people. And so you have this movement from birth till death, and then even after death, there's a continuation of movement. So this being red cedar, and my thought has always been it's a representation of a slice of the Columbia River. And the title of it is PsychoPequa, which means our backbone. I mean, literally the river, the waterways are the backbone of Chinookan culture. Travel by water was the only feasible way to move. Especially on the lower river, the sides of the streams are completely tangles of old growth spruce and firs and cedars, and a very dark and dangerous place to be. So all the movements through canoes and along the waterways. And those places in the forest are so dark and so mysterious. The stories talk about a lot of monsters and a lot of things that can go wrong if you dare to venture into that. And some of my artwork oftentimes refers to those creatures that live there. So at this end of the panel, this represents the mouth of the Columbia River. And there's some representations. The orca pod here is just a representation of the strength and the danger and the power of that portion of the river. It's the high status end of the river. This panel is a representation of stars. And so you have the sun here on the bottom, and the moon, and morning star, all characters that are often spoken about in our stories. And it's there so that you can imagine seeing that star reflection off the water at night. You know, that flickering light as the current moves. And there's a bowl with some various things, our money, our dentalium shell, and some gambling dice made out of elk antler. Gambling was a huge thing in our culture. And I talk about that status. Status was in movement, it was in flux. Everybody was always after some form of higher status. But at the same time, you could gamble your 3 generations of wealth away overnight and lose it all, and go from a high status person to low status person. And just the opposite as well. That was one of the ways you could climb from low status and gain high statuses through gambling. So there's a lot of spirituality involved with that, a lot of tamanos. Tamanos is our word for spirit power. So if you ever see a modern day stick game, and these guys are drumming and singing, they're all putting out their power, their tamanos. and they're trying to keep the other team from being able to see those dice. They're trying to blind those people from guessing the dice. Also in here, so this is just kind of a little treasure thing, a piece of nephrite, the most valuable of all the stones that were available to us, and it's because its structure is such that it's both hard and resistant to breaking. So it was used for our adzes, our working adzes for carving, especially for the canoes. So you have the mouth, and also on this side you'll see a red zigzag. And that is a representation of the spirit world. That place, the land of the dead, where the ancestors go when they pass. And they go over there, and there are houses there, and they live in a world just like we see here. But it's a spirit world. So us as mortals, if we were powerful enough to go to that land and look at that, we couldn't make sense of what we see. Everything seems backwards, and canoes are rotten, and people are skeletons, and they're catching fish, but what we see is leaves and twigs, so there's nothing there that makes sense. And so a lot of what you see here, these two pieces and these skulls, are representations of that kind of crazy, because we're sitting here as mortals and we're looking at a representation of that world. So you see skulls and things that are not right. So that's what that zigzag on that side is about. This is just the physical side of the Columbia River. And as this carved figure is the human form of the Columbia River, Huamal. And he's, of course, very high status and very powerful. And he has some of his wealth items here that I've put. This jade dagger, which is heavily carved on the handle. He has a nephrite adze blade here. And he has a carved pendant with river serpents, which would be potentially a sign of his tamanawas, or his spirit power, since he would have control over those monsters that live in his world. Here you have three little figures. So you have the physical flow of this river. And current, just like our culture, that's kind of what I see this river as. It's just flowing constantly towards the ocean. But along the way of our culture, about the late 1700s, you have first contact by Europeans and the beginning of an enormous disruption, which continues to this day. Huge loss of life, huge loss of cultural information, because cultural information is all stored in the minds of elders and the craftspeople that make things. So if you can imagine 100 canoe makers, and they have all that canoe making information in their head, and they're passing that down to their future generations. They're the computers, they're the storage, the cloud of centuries and centuries of that technology. And then here comes influenza and smallpox, and 99 out of 100 of those canoe makers pass. And a good deal of the students that are learning pass. Now you have one knowledge keeper who, maybe he wasn't the most knowledgeable of all, but that's all you have now. So you start getting cultural information passed down the line through all this interruption, and it's a bit jumbled and it's a bit mixed up, and but it's still moving. So these three figures represent that kind of that point of time where people are dying so fast, they're not being buried properly, they're not being treated properly. They can't make the journey from this side of the river to their ancestors on the other side of the river. And so here they're just swirling around, confused and caught, stuck in limbo, because they can't get over there. They haven't been properly treated. So it's both a testimony to that and the difficulties and the horrors, but it's not an end of movement. It's still movement. Here you have a canoe of a bit of those fractured survivors and people like myself that are picking up the pieces and putting them back together and carrying on with the culture as we still move forward. And that's kind of what I had in mind with this canoe. It's just traveling down the center of the river in this current. The dancing staffs and the paddle and the necklace are all, again, items that signify the wealth of this individual here. And so I do have an install as part of this, as another way to show that things continuously move. Greg, and why don't you come up too, Sarah? There's 2 pieces to install. You can do it from that side. So let Greg, so this just installs right there on the 2 glue spots. Yep. On the 2 glue spots, right there. And then this just installs just like that on the 2 glue spots.
Oh, geez, okay. Right?
Yeah. That's good. Good job.
Thank you.
So these are carved from yellow cedar, as is the pendant and the paddle are both yellow cedar. Yellow cedar is in Oregon, but it's not particularly carving quality cedar. So it was available to us on the trade routes from Alaska. I'm always kind of enamored by yellow and red cedar being together because I see them as relatives that are kind of living in separate places. And so this is in my romanticized mind as a way for them to be together and to spend time together. This represents a river serpent, and the river serpents in our stories were these very, very powerful entities, very large. They lived in these dark, dangerous, swirling holes in the Columbia River and in the bays. And when a canoe would be tipped over and natives would drown, it was blamed on these serpents. And so these serpents were just tremendously inconvenient, obviously, for blocking these travels. And so there were very few characters strong enough to deal with them, and Coyote was one of those characters. Coyote in our culture is kind of a bit of a bumbling, omnipotent creator. And when the world is transitioning from the animal-human world to the current world, Coyote is directed to go and make changes in the new world for these people. And so in this case, he's sent down to deal with some of these monsters, and he actually has to go down and get swallowed by one, and he kills the serpent from the inside out. But you know, he even says it was difficult, very hard for him to do. So to me, they symbolize the dangers that we as humans face in the world, in our lives. And so it's arching over this canoe as a symbol of that, of the tenacious fluctuation of life, the delicate threads that keep us in this world. But there are also challenges that can be overcome, and the canoe is going underneath of that. It's getting past that serpent. And maybe that's because some spirit power is being called into play there. But yeah, so that's what that is. And if we think about the water world, so this is the surface film of the water. There's a whole world going on underneath of that as well. There are things living in houses and people carrying on just like we do in this world. And they have their monsters and they have their heroes. And I mentioned the gambling dice. That's actually associated with, gambling powers associated with that underwater world. And the old stories there were people who drowned and would go down there and they would be taken into one of those houses and to be recovered and treated. And while they were down there, they would be given gambling power and sent back up. So you have all these worlds. The sky world is the same. You have that's the world above us, and it exists just as this world does, with houses and people. And so I think that sums it up, other than the basket was kind of a late thought on my part, but I wanted something that spoke to those things left unfinished after the diseases and the disruption came into play. So you can imagine all of these projects underway, houses that are partially built and canoes that are partially made, and an untold number of baskets that are started, and then 90% of the village dies within a 2-week period of time. So you can imagine all these things left undone. And so this basket is all done except for the cap. And it's been this way now for I don't know how many years, 10 years probably. But I thought it was a good symbol of that tragedy. And I could go on and on about that, but the reality is that we've overcome that, and we still exist in this world, and we're still practicing our cultural practices, our songs, our dances, our carving, our stories. They all continue. So let's talk about, I'll start at this end, just work my way around, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So this box, its title is The High Status of Salamander. It's red and yellow cedar. We talked about the status, so this obviously has to do with that, and it shows Salamander, which in our stories is a high status individual, because it is, along with a few other characters associated with the first fishing net. So when Coyote's establishing the world, Coyote has a contest with his brother Snake, and they hire Frog, and they bring in Salamander to make this first net. Coyote and Snake actually have a little contest to see who can finish their net first. And of course, Coyote thinks he's winning by miles, and that wakes up one morning and sees Snake's done. So, but it was the first piece that was collected by the museum. So I'm very honored to have it as part of their permanent collection. So when we're done here, come up and take a look at it, and it shows Salamander with his status above the humans that are below him. And to this day, there's we don't know a lot of our taboos, but one of the taboos we do know about is their Frog and Snake and Salamander of high enough status that you come across them in your path, you don't step over the top of them, you have to kind of walk around them. Stepping over a person or is rude and is considered not worthy of their status. So, and there's even consequences. So it's a minor taboo to break, perhaps, but you always hear people in the tribe say, well, you might get stung by a bee if you break that taboo. The paddle next to it is yellow cedar. I carve a lot of yellow cedar just because it has the advantage of having a denser grain to the wood, and so it takes a better detail, and I'm kind of crazy about detail, so I like it for those reasons. It's just a beautiful wood to carve. And the title of that is The Sun's Grandson, and it relates to a story. Almost everything I do relates to a story in some way or another. And there's a long story about the son and his grandsons and this big adventure they go on. We're not in our storytelling time, so I have to be careful how much storytelling I tell, or I'll get stung by a bee. Or worse. The painting here, I haven't done a lot of paintings. This is just acrylic on heavily gessoed print paper, and it shows family. So, a female, male, and a child embraced, and just speaks to the movement of family. There's always new generations replacing generations that have passed. It does show some of I guess I'll talk a little bit about Chinookan art style, because Chinookan style remains to this day to be obscure, even though at one time this is probably among the world's most powerful cultures. But some of the things that are easy to identify with Chinookan culture are this heavy eyebrow ridge and the nose. Simplistic faces, but zigzags. Everywhere in our art form are these zigzags, and you'll see it on almost everything I do in one form or another. So you see zigzag shapes and geometric shapes. Also the numbers 3 and 5. So you see 3 circular elements on the shoulder, and there's 3 planes on the arm bands, and there's 3 ribs. 5 being actually the more significant of the numbers. And that's related to in the stories where you'll see one line repeated 5 times constantly over and over, in the songs they're the same way. This piece just relates to the battles that were always going on in the animal-human world. 2 very powerful characters here, Salmon being an enormously powerful figure, and generally a good figure, one of the hero types of the stories. And they're battling of course, their nemesis, sea lion. So I just liked the movement of this piece for this exhibit. But you also can see again the geometric shaping, heavy shoulder elements, and the exposed ribs, what they oftentimes call that the X-ray effect. But generally, when you see that, and that's in almost everything, it reflects to the spirit world. So that's that supernatural point in time, the animal world, where they were kind of shifting back and forth between animal and human form. So that's what that's about. The weird looking canoe over here, and it looks weird on purpose. It's kind of flooding and it's listing, and the people in it are weird looking and they're staring up. The canoe is burnt and cracked, and that's because what we're looking at is a spirit canoe. So as says mortals, that's the image that we see. We don't get the privilege of seeing them as we would in our world. So if you get a chance to see that, it's got a resin in it, and it has a mother of pearl on the bottom, just to kind of give you that kind of shimmering. Even though it's meant to be a flooding canoe, I wanted it to also have some spiritual kind of connotations to it. The outsides of our canoes were burnt as a way to preserve the outsides. And when you see black canoes and red insides, that's what that was was pretty much about. The Grave Guardian, kind of an ongoing battle that we Chinookan tribes and all the tribes fight, are grave robberies, the removal of items that prevent these figures from transferring over. One of the things that disrupts that is the removal of their burial items. So if they're missing parts of their bones, they can't come back complete on the other side of the world. They're crippled. So it's a heinous crime for people to take our relatives' bones and possessions and take them away from there. And it's probably the worst possible crime you can commit in Chinook country. And in the old days, if you were caught doing something like that, it was an immediate death sentence. They would just kill you on the spot. But Hudson's Bay was one of the early culprits. They would go out at night, and they would go to the burial islands and take the flattened skulls. The flattened heads were a big status symbol for our people, but they were also a great curiosity to the Europeans at that time period, where they were fascinated by all these different skull types. So to this day, we have a lot of our relative skulls in Europe, in museums and in displays, and it's a very upsetting thing. So this grave guardian is meant to look just horribly frightening. It's meant to be intimidating, and the little figures in his eyeballs, it's all about being this powerful, menacing force that looms over anybody who dares mess with those things. I recently posted on my Facebook page some things that were stolen from Kalapuyan, a close relative of Chinookans Calipuians were up on the Willamette River. And they were taken quite a while ago. They were specifically taken from burial mounds. And so I stated on there that, the ramifications for taking something like that. It didn't just poison the individual who did that, it poisons their entire extended family. So it was just remains to this day for us, it's poison to be in possession of that. It's just toxic. And so it's just meant to be a very menacing force. And when I'm done with this, we'll actually go, I'm hoping to put it in the Bay Center Cemetery on Willapa Bay where all my relatives are buried, as to kind of look over that. Because in recent history, believe it or not, this is an actual cemetery. The woman you see in the picture, Cha East, is buried there. Within the last 5-8 years, there was a woman caught in the cemetery digging for beads. And when confronted, she was obstinate about it and defiant, said that she had every right to dig for those because they were artifacts. They were fair game for everybody. I never heard whether she got arrested or what the story was. She obviously got chased out of there, but it shows you the mentality there's still people that feel entitled to those objects. And so it's very upsetting, and the tribes are always in battle to repatriate those types of things. The painting there is Cha East. It's my representation of Cha East, who's featured in some of the Boaz pictures, or Curtis pictures, I'm sorry. She was very high status. She had summer house in Willapa Bay or winter house in Willapa Bay, and then conducted her business during the summer season on the lower mouth of the Columbia River, which was a common thing to do at that period of time. So this painting, and if you get a chance to see the smaller photograph down below, that's a picture of her in a Hudson's Bay blanket on Willapa Bay, in current day Bay Center. And so that was kind of I wanted to try to represent her and all of her power and her status. And so you see a lot of the Chinookan elements there, the exposed ribs, the heavy collarbone, the eyebrow ridge, the eye treatments, all of that's going on there. And then in her belly region is just her power to reproduce, the woman's ultimate power to reproduce, which is considered very, very powerful, obviously. And then a photo of her, Curtis's photo of her on the beach. I'm assuming that's probably on the beach at Willapa Bay, but it could also be in the Long Beach area on the ocean. She's got a clam basket there, and some of those baskets are still in our family. We still have. My auntie has a lot of those baskets. So with that, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Okay?
Hi. The stone figures that were found off Saudi Island and up at the Dalles, do you think they might have been grave defenders?
That particular piece you're talking about, and we just had a discussion about that actually, and they're getting ready to move that piece.
The big one?
Yeah, and originally I wanted to bring that as the anchor point for my exhibit here. As it turned out, that wasn't possible, but what I had planned to do was to pull it out of its case, give it a cleaning, sing to it, treat it properly, kind of refresh it, bring it back up to the very high status piece. Would have been owned by a very wealthy homeowner and probably propped up outside their house, not likely a grave.
Okay, so
That's something carved.
more of a status type thing?
Yeah, it's something that's been carved to be seen, and so rather than to have it put away in storage, we talked about maybe finding a new place for it where the Chinookan tribes, Grand Run and Chinook, could come in and sing over it and clean it up and put it in a place of prominence where it could be appreciated for its high status, because it's a high status being. Whatever spirit it was as a rock and what status it has, when it got carved, it was elevated in status. So this piece of cedar is being the same way. It was a high status tree, among the highest of all status of trees, but by being carved, it's now higher status than that. And so a completely different life now. And so there's a bit of a longing as everything wants to increase in status. They want to be carved, they want to be elevated. So in my mind, that's the case with that. I hate to place myself as an expert because there really are no experts anymore. And anybody that claims to be an expert, I would question. But my opinion is that that's a high status piece that was propped up outside of a house somewhere on Sauvie's Island. And I think it would be disrespectful for it not to be seen. And if it's going to be put away, it should be put back into the ground where it came from. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you plan to add more pieces to the panel, and if so, do you know what they will be?
I'm not planning on adding any more pieces, mainly just because I'm consumed by other obligations at the moment. Not even sure what's going to happen to all these. Some of these pieces will be sent up to Seattle to the gallery, and the actual panel might become a workbench. It might become different panels. It will be reborn into a different use.
So this is really several pieces of art that you've combined that
Yeah.
will...
It's really just a storyboard. It's to tell a story about cultural movement. Flawdwa, which is the title of all of this exhibit, just means always going forward. So that's what that's about.
Actually, two questions. When you talked about the piece out there, the stone, is that lent to the museum and going back to your people?
I don't know the provenance of it. I'm assuming it's part of their permanent collection. It was probably found by a settler or a family back in the old days and donated to the
And
museum.
now it's going to go back?
No, I don't think it's going to go back.
I was told, like 10 years ago, that the curator at the time heard that somebody had unearthed it on Sauvie Island, and he and some of his friends went over with a truck and they pulled it out and brought it back.
Well, yeah, because all these pieces are under centuries or decades of dirt and soil. So they're all, you have to find them, you have to dig for them. And when you have all those fields that are getting plowed constantly, that's how they usually get popped up. And you can't repatriate sacred items from private lands. It could be repatriated now that it's in the museum's collection if it's identified as a burial type of an item. But yeah, and people more qualified than me would make that type of a decision. But so it's possible it could be repatriated and put back into the ground. Probably not, in my mind, where it should be, which is where it came from, because it'd be put back on private land and we'd be right back where we started.
And the second part of the question, a different question, your paddles have a distinctive
Yeah.
color to them? Is that artistically traditional?
It is a traditional element, and originating, in my opinion, on the Columbia River, although you see some of those up on the Puget Sound and in other locations. The theories, because everything's a theory really, the most common theory is that it was used to stabilize canoes along rocky, root-bound stream banks.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of that theory because if you understand the nature of wood, if you wedge that point down and you put any side pressure on it at all, it's going to split that paddle. Another theory is used during slave raids to pin people to the ground, and probably was used in that manner time to time because it does fit an arm or a neck or something like that. My personal theory, and I've never heard anybody else say this, is it's a seal hunting paddle. We had multiple styles of canoes and multiple styles of paddles on the Columbia River. And this being the most unique, but we had canoes that were specifically made for seal hunting. And so in my mind, and those canoes are made that way so they cut the surface film of the water very sharp, so it makes very little vibration and noise in the water. Seals, when they're sleeping out in the water, they're kind of got their ear up and they're very sensitive to vibration. So if you look at those paddles and notice the fine points, in my mind, it opens up the surface film, kind of splits it for the paddle to go down inside the film without making a whole lot of. That's the most common sense thing I can think of, but there's nobody alive that can say that with certainty.
Is the very narrow and downturned mouth traditional?
It is, if you, especially in this smaller picture of my grandmother, if you see native women, ladies especially, their mouths are generally turned down. It's not because they're sad. I always say they're serious, but yeah, I hear that a lot. And why is everything so sad? But it's really more about the serious nature of those highly respected ladies in our culture who had a lot of sway and a lot of power. There's also the upturned mouths. I've carved some figures in that. It looks a bit cartoonish to me, not to be disrespectful to that form of art. So I tend to go with the more serious because I guess I see my art as more serious than whimsical. But yeah, they're in both manners. But I typically make the downturned mouths. Yeah, and it is traditional. Go to the back.
So I'm noticing that your jacket is the same
Yeah.
design as the painting.
Yeah.
Did you do that? Is it sewn or is it painted?
It's actually just printed on a white jacket. So all the black is just. It was an experiment on my part. There was a website that you could send them a graphic and they just kind of put it over the top of the fabric and had some way to print it. So
Could you turn around to the back?
yeah. I thought it was cool, a cool concept. So.
What does the red stripe signal?
Well, red, again, is you have to. The opinion varies on red and black, but in my teachings and understandings, black is generally the significance of the mortal world, the earth, and also fighting, and the red is a reference to spirit, power, or the heavens. Patty?
That was my question.
Oh, okay.
Ann asked.
Anybody else?
Do you care to speak to the status of Chinookan people during this?
I'll speak around it. I spent almost 10 years on tribal council, and I fought those battles for a long time, all the way through the recognition and then the unrecognition and the restoration bill, and I was involved in all of that. But there is a thought that when you produce artwork, that you have to be clean. Your head has to be what we would say dret, flush, or straight. So I left council specifically to pursue my art because an piece of art is a sponge. And if you're sick or your head's in an angry place, you put that in there, and because these pieces end up in people's homes, I don't feel good about, even if I get the flu, for example, I'll stop working because I don't want any part of that sickness to be put into that piece. Basket makers feel very strongly about that. If you ever go to a basket making class, they'll tell you to leave the room if you're feeling bad or angry. You shouldn't weave because you weave it right into your work. So I will not speak about recognition. It's an ongoing battle. I have my cousin Sam Robinson is the vice chair. Ray Gardner was my first cousin who was chair during that whole period of time, who's passed now. Tony Johnson's now running the tribal council, and I are active in pursuing different aspects of recognition.
The sea serpent is really strikingly similar to very old Chinese images of dragons,
Right.
which are water creatures
Right.
as well. How did you decide how to carve that head? Did it have anything to do, are there actual old pictures of Chinookan
There are.
serpents?
I may have seen a painting or a bit of rock art, but I haven't seen any. There are not a lot of wood carvings that have survived simply because of the climate, and there weren't a lot of early collectors. So by the time people started thinking they should start collecting some things, a lot of the wood pieces were gone. So you see a lot of stone, a lot of bone, and a lot of shell carvings. The head is similar to the coyote representations on carvings. So that's mostly where that basic head style comes from, and the rest of it's my interpretation using Chinookan style elements, the shell inlay in the eyes. We did a lot of shell inlay on our work. The zigzags on the horn and the zigzags on the spine and the body treatments are all just Chinookan elements. So the serpent itself is not necessarily based on an actual artifact. It's based on my interpretation of the art as I've come to understand it. Well, you see serpents are a huge culture all the way up and down the Northwest Coast and East Coast, everywhere. Every culture has their version of serpents, whether they're land serpents or sky serpents or lightning snakes, which I sometimes will put into my art.
And they're always powerful spirit creatures.
Yeah.
Do the zigzags have any significance, or are they just traditional?
They're a very traditional element. My theory is they're a representation of spirit power, or that supernatural world, but there are varying opinions. I've heard people say that it's representative of water, the river, mountains, and there's nobody in my mind qualified to state definitively what they're for.
What are you working on now?
I'm actually working on a giant version of similar to this pendant, the serpent pendant. So there are three serpents. It's 7 feet tall, so it's a pretty big sized pendant. And so it's just 3 serpents, kind of. I call that a nest. So they're all wrapped around each other, and that's what I'm working on currently. What else? I have a small panel in works. I always have usually one large project and a couple of smaller projects going at any given time. Yes?
I just am curious, this is kind of a silly question, but do you have anything to say about the relationship between your figures with their eyes and faces and the little green men from outer space?
That's another thing I hear all the time. They look like aliens. Also, I don't have anything with a headdress in here, unusual. So some of my carvings, you'll see these quite large, elaborate headdresses. And so I'll hear, oh, that looks Egyptian or Polynesian, and then people want to connect the dots between that culture and our culture. And actually, that headdress is found on objects from 10,000 years ago on the Columbia River. And it's a representation in my mind of the fur headdresses that we had at the time, which were sea otter fur, and they had these side dangles that came down, and those were decorated with dentalium shell and geometric patterning on the front, and then eagle feathers up on the top. So that's, in my mind, what those headdresses represent. But yeah, the alien thing, I get a lot. If you look at this, if you've studied this art form, you've seen a lot of very simplistic representations of the art. So it's been a challenge as a person making his living carving the art, to carve this art in a way that is sellable, because people don't necessarily want to buy a very simplistic figure. And it was kind of fun to do this exhibit because I was able to actually do some simplistic figures for a change and carve with just thought rather than in regards to what's going to be sellable. I carve everything is important. I don't want to minimize the gallery work. I just carve gallery work differently than what I've been able to carve some of the things in here for. Some of these pieces will go to the gallery, but some of them will be recycled and reused in some other way. The dagger, the paddle, this panel in the back will all end up going to Seattle.
When you say the gallery, is that your gallery in Handleview in Seattle?
Yes,
What
and
gallery is that?
Steinbrück Gallery. And I was at Quintana's here is where I started my gallery run. They were very, very good for me, and they of course closed recently, retired. So now I'm only represented in Seattle at the moment. Yeah.
Is there any talk of anybody picking up
Well, Greg is a carver. Tony Johnson and Earl Davis from Shoalwater, which is Shoalwater tribe is a Chinookan tribe, and they're relatives of mine. They have a carving program going, so there is some slow steam gathering. Lillian Pitticourse has been involved in Columbia River art for a long time. Many of us consider her to be kind of the grandmother figure of this revival of Columbia River art, but it remains still a very obscure art form. It was really sad for Quintanos to go out just because this is no better place in the world to sell Columbia River art than right here, where the art comes from. So Seattle, they're a little confused by it because Seattle Gallery has mostly Alaskan art, but it's done well. I've done well there. The more pieces I produce, the more body of work I get going, the more people understand it and know what's going on with. Now you guys all understand it a little more.
Yes.
And I teach through Grand Ron, I'm teaching constantly, and so we're always looking for this next generation of artists to step up and carry on.
The salmon are under the water, and are they a spirit also?
Well, all the animals at one time were supernatural, and how we as humans came into the world, we were actually, for my village or my people down on the mouth, Thunderbird, goes into a story I can't go into, but Thunderbird lays 5 eggs on the top of Saddle Mountain. So if you're ever down there and see Saddle Mountain, it's got that depression in there. So Thunderbird built a nest there, laid those eggs. An ogress, a giant woman monster, went up there and was going to eat the eggs and got up there and shook them and determined they were no good and would throw them off. And when they fell and broke, those were the first 5 Chinook people in this world. So in that old world, yes, salmon was, he lived in both worlds. He was he could be a salmon, he could be a human on land, and there's stories of him winning contests of strength where virtually no other animal could break this set of antlers, is what it was. And he's all disguised and pretending to be a poor person, and at the very end, when nobody could break it, Blue Jay, who is our trickster, wants to say, okay, nobody won, because he couldn't break it either. Salmon kind of shakes off this dirty robe, and now he has an otter skin robe. And he's got all his wealth, and he's so handsome and powerful, and he goes up there and breaks the antler. So it's a tremendously powerful figure in that world, and of course, obviously very important to us today. Equana is the old word for salmon. All right, well, I guess that will do. You're welcome.